So I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave.
Cancer Living Room. So happy to have all of you in the room. Those of you watching online, those of you who will come back and watch online post live, welcome, welcome, welcome. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Living Room, it's a program that we designed specifically with people living with lung cancer and their loved ones in mind. Bringing to you key opinion leaders and expert speakers from around the country and sometimes around the world to talk to you about varying aspects of the disease. We really try to do this in a language that's easy to understand. So we try to bring all that big science stuff that I know most of you have Googled online at one time or another down to a really palatable, which is also probably too many syllables, but down to a language that folks can understand. So if at any time tonight we're using words that might not make sense, please feel free to just hit the pause button and ask us what it is that we're talking about. And also, as we go through the discussion tonight, please don't forget, this is meant to be interactive. So if you've got questions, please ask them as the questions pop into your mind and as they are relevant to the conversation. We've got experts here that are willing to share information with you that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. So tonight, as you guys may or may not have known, if you're Rick, what we are talking about is clinical trials and innovative clinical trial design. We really, want the objectives of tonight are to demystify clinical trials. I've talked to a lot of you in the past, and a lot of you watching, like I said, live or post-live, who have concerns about what a clinical trial is, what it means, what that might look like for you, when, who's running these clinical trials, when should I consider a clinical trial, how are they designed, what do the different phases mean? There's a lot of, I think, questions that come too. So we're really hoping, and I know that by the end of this evening's program, there will be a better understanding of what that looks like. So tonight, we have with us Dr. Karen Reckamp, and I'm gonna read this quick little just sort of title blurb, but after I'm done doing that, I'm gonna ask each of our panelists, and I don't see Judy or Andrew, I don't know if I'm supposed to, and now for all of you watching live, I'm talking to the people in the back who are managing this program, and I'm sure they'll get them up on the camera soon. But Dr. Karen Reckamp is from Cedars-Sinai Cancer Director, Division of Medical Oncology. She's the Associate Director of Clinical Research, Clinical Professor, Department of Medicine, Study Chair at Pragmatica Lung, and Co-Chair of LungMap. Keep those two sort of things in mind because they're very interesting clinical trial designs that I think a lot of people don't know about. Some hopefully do. And then we have with us up here on the screen Judy Johnson, who from SWOG Cancer Research Network Lung Committee Patient Advocate. So she is your voice on the Southwest Oncology Group, which is a cooperative group, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what that means as we go on too. And then, of course, for those of you who are familiar with this program, Andrew Kupik, who's GO2 Associate Director of Clinical Research. I always feel really tongue-tied after I do that, which is why I don't like to read through bios, because I feel like it's less personal than the person that is here to speak with you, tell you a little bit about themselves and why lung cancer is important to them. So, Karen, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. So I'm Karen Reckamp and have the titles that were mentioned. I'm at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles and the Division Director of Medical Oncology there, but I've been doing cancer and more specifically lung cancer clinical trial research for 20 years now, maybe more. I've been doing this for a long time. And it's interesting, we'll be talking about some of the novel designs. We're starting to think about how do we make this simpler? Because over these last 20 years, I think clinical trials have gotten complicated. And it's been wonderful to learn about all the subtypes of lung cancer that we now treat, and we don't treat it as one disease. We have, personalized medicine in lung cancer, but we've gotten very, very complicated about how we do trials. And so we're trying to take kind of 10, 20 steps back and make them more simplified, and we'll be talking a little more about that. And Judy, as our patient advocate, has been an essential part of helping us to figure out what's important to the patients when we're doing trials, because often that we're thinking about the FDA, we're thinking about how to get the drugs, and the companies are thinking about how to market the drugs and things like that, and so the patient becomes further away from the focus, and really, at the end of the day, all of this is to help our patients with lung cancer. So that's why we're here.
Thanks, Karen. Judy, do you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Should I go?
Not in here.
Can you hear me?
But,
It's coming from.
sorry,
Okay,
Judy.
I've
should you
got the
turn up your
mic
mic in the
on.
room?
Want to try again?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's like
thank you.
coming from over there.
Okay, go ahead, Judy. So everybody online can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I'm Judy Johnson. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, and I got involved with lung cancer research. Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you are. Perfect.
Oh, all right. Okay, great. All right. So Judy Johnson. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. All right. Live in St. Louis, Missouri, and I got involved in lung cancer research because my father had lung cancer back in the early 2000s and before there was personalized therapy and did not make it. So I am inspired to do everything I can to fight this disease. Can you hear me now? Is there any echo or are we good? Okay. Anyway, I got involved with SWOG about 6 years ago, and it's been great because the principal investigators like Dr. Reckham have incorporated me into the whole process of developing clinical trials and making sure that the patient voice is represented at all times. So I appreciate that opportunity, and I really appreciate being here with all of you to learn from you and help me do my job even better. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. I'm really looking forward as we kind of move through the conversation tonight to hearing what your experience has been like, because it's such an important part of what Dr. Reckamp sort of started by saying, keeping the patient at the forefront of the decision-making process as we're going through all of this. So thank you. Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Danielle, and everyone. Great to be on this panel tonight. So, my name is Andrew, and like they said, I work with clinical research at Coaching Foundation. But really, what that means is I kind of do two things. One is, probably the most when I interact with patients, I'm part of our lung match team, which means I help people answer the questions about clinical trials, I help people do clinical trial searches, and just kind of really translate what the results of new lung cancer research might mean for you as a patient and making your decisions. But I also do a lot of thinking about how we can make clinical trials more designed in a way that reflects what everyone who has lung cancer really wants and is really interested in. I talk to people who design clinical trials. I work with the centers that do clinical trials just to rethink how we do clinical trials and make sure that the patient is at the center of that. And so I'm really kind of approaching it from both ends. And it's just great to be on this panel with two people who are also really thinking about this every day. And I look forward to the discussion.
I just like hearing more from Judy and Dr. Renkamp, and am anxious for folks to hear more from you. I know that a lot of people might not know this, but not everybody has the benefit of being seen at a Cedars or down the street here at a Stanford or up the street at UCSF or a large academic center or even a large cancer center, right, where most of these clinical trials are happening. And so the work that Andrew and the Lung Match team do is to help identify patients, particularly patients in more sort of rural areas who don't have access to clinical trials based on what their sort of criteria is, right? Because a lot of times the healthcare providers won't even discuss a clinical trial because it's 50 or 60 miles away, and it's maybe the person they're talking to has an aunt or a sister 50, 60 miles away, right? And so what the work that happens through Lung Match, I think, is really critical. So with that and being cognizant of time, let's jump in.
Great.
So in the spirit of demystifying clinical trials, let's talk a little bit about what a clinical trial is. They're not always drug trials, right?
No, so a trial can be really anything that we study, and we think about patient-oriented clinical trials, so that these are things that interact with the patient. And it can be anything from a blood test or any kind of biosample. We're doing a lot with microbiome, so it even goes to things like our stool that we collect. And sometimes that's over periods of time, and you can be a part of that trial and also part of a treatment trial. There are things looking at diagnostics. We've had big studies looking at screening. CT screening for smokers is something that helps to cure more patients with lung cancer. So screening trials, and then everything prevention. At our institution, we do a lot of diet trials for prevention and prevention of symptoms. And then what we talk about probably the most is treatment trials. But the treatment trials also can be at any time of the cancer diagnosis. And so again, we can do things for prevention for somebody who doesn't have cancer. We don't have a lot of those types of trials in lung cancer at this moment in time. We just heard at our big ASCO meeting 2 weeks ago about interventions for early stage, what we call neoadjuvant before someone goes to surgery, or adjuvant after someone goes to surgery, to help cure more people with lung cancer. And then the typical trials, which are treatment trials in the more advanced stage, where we're often learning about new drugs or comparing them to the standard of care type of treatment, trying always to improve our treatments for patients and help outcomes to be better and quality of life to be better.
So when we're talking specific to drug trials, they're phased, right? So what does that look like? Just high level. I know it's complicated, but.
So, I mean, in general, a phase 1 trial is a trial where we're looking at a drug where we don't know that much about. And I think the important thing to know is that the primary objective of that trial is to look at the side effects and to see how safe it is. In non-cancer, those are done in healthy people. In cancer, they can only be done in cancer patients who have had all the treatments that are available. And so the helping the cancer is kind of a secondary. We are always hoping for that, and all the drugs that we got to, immunotherapy, targeted therapies, have all gone through phase 1 testing, but the primary purpose is to look at side effects. Sometimes we're combining 2 drugs in a phase 1 trial, so we may know more about what those drugs do and how they work in lung cancer and how they work, how safe they are. And so that may be a little bit safer or a little bit more known to go into a phase 1 trial that has known medications or known drugs in other diseases. We just haven't tested them in lung cancer. So but a first in human phase 1 trial, sometimes they're starting at very low doses. So if you go in and you're the very first person in that phase 1 trial, you may get a dose that's not, maybe the drug is good, but the dose you get is not the right dose yet. And so they're dose finding and they're looking at side effects. Phase 2 is that middle ground. And sometimes it is just a drug, and they're giving it to somebody, and they're trying to understand how well it works, what we call efficacy. But sometimes it's compared to another standard. Sometimes they do it at multiple doses, but it's usually a smaller trial looking to see if there's a signal. And then phase 3 tend to be large trials and tend to be what we consider kind of the definitive, what you hear randomized, sometimes placebo-controlled, but in the US in this day and age, placebo-controlled doesn't mean you're not getting treatment. It means you're getting a standard of care treatment. And knowing that we don't know which one is better, sometimes that standard of care, I would say most of the time, that standard of care is the better option. Everybody wants the new option, but that's not always the case. So generally they're randomized, and that means that you're going in saying, I'm willing to get either treatment here. And so that's generally how a phase 3 trial is run, but we're really looking to make sure that it is better than the standard of care, and then it has implications for getting FDA approved and things like that.
I think it's important to reiterate what you said about getting standard of care therapy versus study drug therapy, because I think this is one of those sort of continued misunderstandings out there that people do think they're getting the placebo or a sugar pill or basically no treatment versus a maybe drug treatment. So I think that is something that is really important to point out. And when we talk about dosing, is sometimes there are and you don't hear about this, but almost like a phase 4 sort of version of a trial. What does that mean? And that's usually, well, I'm going to let you explain.
So phase 4 is usually what we call post-marketing. So the drug has gotten some approval by the FDA, but they want to learn more. Often it's in cancer drugs, especially targeted therapy, it's often a food effect. And so they want to see, well, all of the people got it without food. And we find sometimes the toxicity is actually more when people take it on an empty stomach. So they do a food effect and they take it with food and they do some tests. There are often lots of blood tests and things like that involved. Or post-marketing to just study some specific side effects or get a better idea of what those side effects are. Some of the best examples are the COX-2 inhibitors, which are not for cancer, but the cardiac effects and things like that. So they want to do extra studies. But we know that the drugs are approved, the drugs have efficacy, they've gotten through the bars of the FDA, and now we're studying different aspects of those drugs. And then there are trials where we use just different combinations of drugs we know a lot about, and we look at novel ways of looking at those, but we have a little bit more knowledge about what these drugs are. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about those when we talk about novel designs.
So just quick show of hands, anybody in the room, and maybe give a ping or hands up online, those of you watching, how many people have participated in a clinical trial? So we've got 3 in the room, and I'm sure some online, or somebody that's like, was that a clinical trial? I'm watching you, Tina. I don't know. Does anybody want to share your experience or what that looked like? If so, Rick, will you grab a mic? Yeah, you have to project in the room.
Hello?
There you go.
It works, okay. So I'm on a couple clinical trials. My very first clinical trial was back in 2016 when a new drug was out called X396. And this was a cancer drug for ALK, which I'm ALK. And this was when alectinib wasn't out yet. And this drug became available. I had a choice. They said you can kind of stay on your crizotinib, you got brain mets, that's not really working well, or we can go to chemo, or we can try this new pill. And then they spell it all out. And the deal is, you can quit at any time, so there's really no downside. If you sign up for it, they're going to give you this med that probably is better than any other med on the market at the moment. Theoretically, right? So I'm looking at, there's really no downside. When you're on this drug, they're going to do all kinds of extra testing, lots of extra scans, lots of extra checking your heart rate, your EKGs, so you get totally looked at. So again, really no downside other than maybe time. But the bottom line is they're going to take really good care of you, looking at you very thoroughly while you're getting this new drug that will probably help you better than anything else in the market. So I decided, sure, why would I not do that? So I did it. I was on that drug for about 2.5 years, had virtually no side effects. I was lucky. Some people do, I didn't, but it was a really good drug. It prolonged my life 2.5 years on just that one med. After that, I went to alectinib, which is a common drug in the ALK world, and that drug almost killed me. So again, everybody's an individual, everybody's different. So that drug did not work for me. And now currently, I'm online to get on NVL 655, a brand new trial, which is down in Irvine, down in Irvine. And I'm ready to start that. I go down for some more testing next week, and I'll start it in 2 weeks if it's good. And my whole thing is clinical trials. All you do is get extra tests, extra looked at. Why would you say no?
Can you talk about the screening process? Because there's that process where you don't necessarily know if you're going to go on the trial, right? There are lots of things
Right.
you have to pass through.
So
please.
depending on whatever the test is, depending on what the trial is, they have different screening things. You may have to have already had this drug or that drug. You may not have. You couldn't have had that drug. You have to have this type of a med. They may need samples of tissue. They may need, different things because they want to know what the drug is targeting. So they want to know that they have the right thing that they're going after. So they need that data up front, which again, I always believe knowledge is king. The more tests they're going to do to find out the more about you, the more they can help you. So why not? And again, you can always quit at any moment. So why would you ever say no to a trial? Is how I look at it. That's my point.
Is there, at any point, and this is open to anybody online or in the room, did the process feel overly burdensome to you?
I never had any problems with it because Dr. Neal's team, they were always pretty good at working with your schedule. I mean, on the day when they're going to give you the drugs in the very beginning, the first time, it's usually kind of like a 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 hour day where they want to look at all kinds of things before they give it to you, as they give it to you, after they give it to you, because they're kind of looking for reaction. So it tends to be a little bit intensive on maybe day 1, maybe day 2, maybe day 7, at the beginning. But once you get into it, it becomes into a normal routine where all you do is maybe get one scan every 6 weeks instead of getting a scan every 3 months, which is, again, a good thing. It takes a little more time, but it's all free, so why would you not? Oh, that's another thing for people who don't have insurance. Drug trials are usually, not only the drug is free, but so is all the testing, because that's all covered on the backside from the drug company. So that's another advantage. If someone doesn't have health insurance and is in the system, if they get into a trial, at least all that stuff's free. How'd I do?
I would say most of the time, the things that are standard of care would go through an insurance and not be covered by the trial.
If your standard of care was you get a scan every, say, 6 months, and they wanted every 6 weeks, those extra scans would be
Would be
part
covered
of
by
the trial.
the trial, yeah.
And also, they usually cover travel and stuff. There's a lot of things in trials, if you really look into it, that they take care of. I mean, mine was close to home. It was an easy drive, no big deal. But I found the trial to be very rewarding. And you also get to feel good about possibly pushing a drug forward that can help the next guy. I mean, if nobody did trials in the past, we wouldn't be here today. So, that's part of the whole game, too. What can you do for the next guy? Because somebody did it for you in the past. Paying it forward.
I love that. So we kind of jumped ahead on the agenda, which I think is fantastic because it almost fits, not almost, it does sort of fit better in this part of the conversation. And we walked through the study staff sort of explaining the trial and the study to you, the intake process. So did you have to do any monitoring or journaling, or I have to record things outside of?
So the only thing that they really wanted me to do was they wanted me to monitor what time I took the pill in the first trial in the beginning because I think they called it a phase 1, phase 2. So it was probably more of a phase 2 than a phase 1 because they had already been in humans for a while. I don't know, I was probably into it about a little over a year from its first patient, from drug 1. And I was like patient 65. And there was one other friend of ours, Corey, I won't mention any last names, but she's in the group too, and she was on X396 for about 6.5 years, so she was on it longer than me. The trial went really, really well, but they did not bring it to approval in the United States because I guess with Electinib or Dotinib, for whatever business reason, they never brought it through to being approved here, but it is approved in Japan and some other place. But yeah, they had journaling to make sure that, they want to know the efficacy of it, but they also want to know you're actually taking it when you're supposed to. So they did ask for that. And you have to bring them back the bottles. You can't keep any pills. So like they give you 30 pills, but it's only for 28 days. So you go and give them the 2 pills back and you get the new bottle for the next 30 days. And they keep close eyes on that. But for the most part, it was very simple. And you knew they were really watching you, checking your labs, checking your everything every month. So, like I said, it's kind of like, it's like heightened care with no real effort on your part other than showing up. It was really good.
I love hearing that you had such a positive experience. I do want to, something cropped up, and I do want to ask the question because I know we will get the question. When drugs aren't approved here but are approved elsewhere, then what? And I see heads nodding. And that's for Dr. Reckamp. Sorry.
Well, I think we're seeing more of this, but the X396 is a good example, and who knows what will evolve. But there's a lot of things involved in getting drugs approved. And obviously, when you have a company that is a for-profit company or a company that is trying to put these drugs out there, there's a lot that goes into it before it even goes into a person. And they're trying to keep this, what we call research and development, R&D, moving along. And so generally, the US market is kind of the gold standard, but more and more other regulatory bodies in Asia, in Europe, have a little bit different criteria, even for the number of patients with, their type of race and ethnicity involved. And the U.S. is starting to think about that a little bit more, looking at, so we're not just taking trials that have everybody in China and say, okay, we'll approve this drug. So there's a lot of complicated regulatory pieces that go into why a drug is or isn't approved. And where I think the U.S. was always the place where everybody wanted it approved, they're now looking at angles across the world as avenues, even if the U.S. is not the market where they can make it into. And I don't know if Andrew has any insights into this aspect of clinical trial development or drug development.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we can see a lot of different clinical trial designs. I mean, we're seeing more clinical trials being done internationally. I've seen clinical trials open sites both in the United States and Europe and Asia, and often, there are multiple countries being done at the same time. But I also think we're seeing, where in the past a lot of clinical trials might have been done in the U.S. and then opened internationally or other things, we're starting to see clinical trials done in other countries first, and sometimes that actually makes a lot of sense. Like a great example is for patients with EGFR mutations in their lung cancer tumor. A lot of the research that's coming out for clinical trials with EGFR has sometimes started in China, and there's a really good reason for that, and that's that people of Asian descent, lung cancer patients, tend to have higher rates of developing an EGFR mutation. So in countries like China, it's a very big issue to their patient population because they tend to have more patients with EGFR mutations. And a great example of that is that we saw at the most recent ASCO meeting, where was data being presented from the Wukong series of clinical trials that started in China with a new EGFR inhibitor called sunvozertinib. And we're actually seeing that with the early phase clinical trials, they started in China, but as we learned more about those drugs, they're starting to open clinical trial sites in the United States. So I think, sometimes things are, eventually gain broader access as we start to understand them and go through. And so I think, one of the positive developments I've seen is that we're thinking more of lung cancer and cancer in general as a global community. And, while it's not always possible because of, things that Dr. Reckamp mentioned of different regulatory bodies and different rules in different countries, there is a thought about how can we make, global access more available to patients no matter where they start. And so, just because a clinical trial is being done in one place, it may eventually open sites in another country to develop. And that's one of the things that we always have discussions with people about.
Judy, does any of this play a role in your participation, like this information? What role might it play in your participation with the SWOG?
Can you hear me now? All right, I'm going to guess that you can hear me. And I guess the thing that strikes me about it is, since everything is becoming more global, and one of the outcomes of the pandemic that was positive is that there was so much information shared via Zoom all over the world. I mean, people could participate in these conferences and learn about all of this research who could never do that before because there was not a virtual option. So I have learned so much about research all over the world that gives me the information I need to step back and think about the trials that we're designing at the SWOG Cancer Research Network, and just think about how this will impact the patient and what more can we do in the future as we continue to collaborate globally.
Thanks, Judy. So I want to jump into the variety of individuals and organizations that actually run clinical trials. Can we touch on that a little bit? And then I want to finish up with SWOG and take a little bit deeper dive into what the cooperative groups look like.
So since Judy talked about the cooperative groups, I don't know when they started, maybe in the 70s or 80s, kind of as the war on cancer started in the 70s, and cancer centers and all of that. That's kind of when these groups started to come together. But the cooperative groups tend to do trials. So these are trials, and it's evolved over time. So there are multiple cooperative groups. Judy and I come from the SWOG, which is the Southwest Oncology Group. There's ECOG, there's ECOG Akron, and there's Alliance, and there's NRG, which is generally more the radiation oncology trials, and the gynecologic oncology has merged with one of the groups. And so there are lots of different groups that span the country and come together usually to ask big questions and how do we get to, broad populations, mostly across the U.S. There are some international examples, but it's mostly across the U.S. and across all disease type, and from, early detection to screening to early stage to late stage. And we tend to ask questions that probably the industry partners aren't as willing to put money behind to ask those questions. And so often some of the good examples that we have in our lung group now are sequencing of things like immunotherapy, because all of the immunotherapy, we have probably 10 or so different combinations or agents or combinations of agents that can be used as immunotherapy as the first line for advanced non-small cell lung cancer, and all of which have been shown to be better than chemo, but none of which have been compared to each other. And so we all sit and we give you information, and we're giving you the best information we have, but we don't have that information. So there's always these subtle questions that are not going to make anybody more money in the drug industry if we answer them. And so those are the types of questions we tend to try to answer. Or we have a trial called the Lung MAP trial, which we do genetic testing on all patients, and that tends to match people to sub-trials. And so that's another way, when there are small subsets and we're gathering patients from around the country, that's a good way to do that. So that's generally what the NCTN or the cooperative groups do. And now the way they work is that all trials basically can be accessed by anybody who's within those groups. And these are groups that can be anything from rural to at academic institutions. So they are a way for people to get access to trials. It's probably not going to be the most novel therapy. So the industry trials are really generally the trials with the most novel therapies. And those have a lot of rules associated with them, a lot of screening, a lot of testing that needs to get done, and are some of our most complicated trials, but obviously developing drugs that they want to move into the marketplace and move it in rapidly. So the time frames can be a little bit different. And then there are foundations and institutions that run trials. We have investigator-initiated trials. Most institutions will run investigator-initiated trials that are sometimes a combination of either donors or foundations or even industry helping to fund those trials. And again, there are also trials that we do that we're just taking blood or biosamples that we're trying to understand diseases a little better. But generally, the key piece of doing some research is getting funding. So we can have a great question and moving it forward. And when we're talking about drugs, so if I want to do, some of the hardest ones I talk about, we do diet studies at our institution. Those are generally funded by the National Cancer Institute and things like that, because industry is not going to fund those types of trials. And sometimes, you think about vitamins or things like that, and chemo prevention. Those are very hard to get funded through industry because they're generally not drugs that get marketed in that same way. And so, so the funding piece is a key part and a very early part of what we're thinking about for clinical trials. Right now, we're thinking about a clinical trial in SWOG about how to give targeted radiation for what we call oligo, or when a single site or two sites progress, how to give radiation and how to test for residual cancer in the blood. And so as we're trying to do that, there's no drug involved. And so that's the complicated part. And so we had a meeting today that we were putting our heads together, like, how do we get this funded? And sometimes our foundation partners, our patient advocates, sometimes they come up with ideas for how to creatively do this.
Yeah, interesting. Andrew, Judy, do you guys have anything to add?
Three clinical trials
would
right now,
say
and-
that the clinical trials that are offered by the National Clinical Trials Network are able to be accessed by more people and within more communities. And the communities have difficulty running trials sometimes unless they've got support. So I think that it's important to be able to offer these trials that industry isn't able to or won't fund, to give access to more diverse populations.
Andrew, do you have anything to add?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's great with both Dr. Ekamp and Judy talking about, different ways that different groups have come in and done clinical trials. And I think I'm seeing a lot more of a focus on doing clinical trials in new and innovative ways to reach more patients. In addition to the cooperative groups and other things, we're seeing organizations get involved in clinical trials for the first time. I mean, a great example is the work GoTo does in partnership with Alchemy, or the Dario Lung Cancer Medical Institute. They're an international consortium of research partners that really tries to make sure clinical trials can open faster with agreements and get to patients faster among their partners. But they also really focus on how we can bring clinical trials more directly to patients with what we call decentralized designs. And these are things that can either be done at a local clinic, or in fact sometimes even bringing things like blood collection and other things directly to patients at their home. And that's been really great in doing different kinds of studies that wouldn't, again, like Dr. Ekamp said, wouldn't get necessarily done by a company who's interested in testing a drug or a treatment. Two great examples are the SPARK study that Alchemy's been working on, which is really looking at collecting blood and other samples from ALK positive patients who are on an approved ALK inhibitor right now, like adagrasib or sotorasib, and then understanding maybe if those drugs were to ever stop working, what happened to cause them to stop working, and how can we inform future KRAS inhibitors that can help patients. And also things like the Young Lung study that Alchemy is doing, which is looking at a thing we've noticed where there's increasing numbers of younger patients without traditional risk factors who've developed lung cancer, and collecting blood and other samples from them and having them answer questionnaires to understand what's contributing to increasing rates of lung cancer. So these, prevention questions as well can be answered. And so, there's a lot of groups out there that are trying to think of clinical trials in different ways to really help answer questions that are important to the community.
Thank you both. So one more sort of design question. Clinical trials are designed differently, right? They're single arm. there's basket trials, there's umbrella trials. Can you explain the difference in these trials?
So I think we've talked about some of these, but a single-arm trial is obviously you're going to get this drug, so similar to what you experienced. And that's kind of, I think for a patient, it's the easiest one to get your head around, like there's no other question. And then again, and then the randomized trial where it could be one of generally 2 or 3 arms. Usually it's not more than 3 arms for a randomized trial, but you don't get to choose. And so you're putting your name in the hat, and whatever arm they pick is what you get. And so those are the kind of the 2 most standard. Sometimes they're multiple arms, but they're using the investigational drug at multiple doses, so you still know you're going to get that investigational drug. And then the basket trial, so the nomenclature, a basket trial tends to be, so like an example of ALK, that you do ALK in multiple different tumor types, and they all get the drug, but you study the tumor types separately so you can understand that. And so there are many of these rare alterations that happen in many tumors, and ALK is one of them. And so you can do a basket trial, and you put it all in the basket for ALK. And then an umbrella trial is kind of, I guess, what we think of the opposite. So it's covering, so it's generally lung cancer, but maybe testing multiple lines, different combinations, different dosing, and and sometimes they call them octopus because they get really unwieldy and put their tentacles out everywhere. And so some of the early immunotherapy trials or some of the KRAS trials have been like that, and they start adding different, and some of the KRAS trials have been kind of basket and umbrella, where they're doing multiple combinations, but also across many different tumor types. So it's going across the top and the bottom. But those tend to be complicated trials, but they're looking at smaller populations. They tend to not be randomized trials. They tend to be smaller trials, trying to get signals of what kind of combinations are working, or whether these alterations are important and kind of driver alterations across multiple tumor types.
Does that make sense for everybody? Yeah. So we talked a little bit about LungMap. Do we want to talk a little bit about Pragmatica?
Sure. So Pragmatica is kind of the thing we've been working on for about a year now, but I have to say, I'm happy to say that it is actually open. So this is a trial, it's called Pragmatica Lung, and it is based on a trial we did through SWOG and LungMap. So this LungMap is a trial that looks at genetic biomarkers and puts people in matched sub-studies or unmatched. So we had an unmatched sub-study that looked at immunotherapy and something called ramucirumab and the combination of those, and we compared it to standard of care. So it was a phase 2 randomized trial with 2 arms, but it was a smaller trial. So the signal was that we had an improved survival using that combination therapy, but basically, most people who looked at it said this wasn't big enough for me to say this is the new standard of care. And so sometimes when we have a very small population, you can't do a big randomized phase 3 trial, but this is in people who have had immunotherapy, had some response, and then had tumor grow on that immunotherapy. And so there's lots of people who fit that criteria, and so a bigger trial needed to be done. The 2 drugs are Keytruda and Cyramza, or pembrolizumab and ramucirumab, which are drugs that are approved across many tumor types and have been given to thousands, maybe even millions of patients with cancer. And they're both approved in lung cancer for various populations. So we know a lot about these drugs. So we know, and the safety profile doesn't really overlap, and we know from the phase 2 trial that the toxicity that we saw was really about what we would expect. So we know a lot about these drugs. We know that it improved overall survival in a smaller study, and it's also 2 drugs from 2 different drug companies. So how are we going to move this forward? And so because we had this mechanism through our cooperative group setting, and we had buy-in from the FDA, from CTEP, from the NCI, and everybody's thinking, how do we make trials more patient-friendly? How do we get more diversity in our trials? The timing was prime. So we had, at our June meeting last year at ASCO, we presented the data from the phase 2 trial, and almost immediately after that meeting, or even before, we're thinking about how we're gonna move this forward. It really didn't seem like we were gonna move forward because of the drug company. It wasn't as interesting to the drug companies to get together to move a large phase 3 trial forward. But because other groups were involved and felt it was important, and this is a partnership across multiple cancer entities, foundations, Friends of Cancer Research. I mean, we had lots of groups involved who said this is important, and it's important to move forward. So we had a number of calls, and they said, and the FDA and the NCI are already thinking about pragmatic trials. So this was kind of the example of how to have a pragmatic trial, because we have drugs that are safe. We have an endpoint that we know, survival. So when we are looking at survival, we don't need to get the nitty-gritty of a lot of scans and a lot of blood tests or things like that, because we know. And we're using standard of care based on what people would get normally as the control arm. And so we took everything out of this trial that wasn't necessary. And we kept the focus on what are our questions? What is survival, and are we making sure this is still safe for people? And so we're collecting the highest level side effects and unexpected side effects, not the side effects you can read about in the package insert and what we know, but unexpected, and survival. So we don't even require scans. I mean, everybody will get scans, but they will get done totally as standard of care. And so in this trial, there are very few things, and so it helps two ways. There are no labs that need to be drawn. You draw your labs as you normally would in standard of care. So the rural sites, the harder to reach sites, it's easy for them to do this with their patients. And we get questions all the time. Where are the labs? How do I know if my patient is eligible? And we say if you would do this in your practice, this is what it is. And so there are, and the work that our staff has to do. So post-COVID, we're all struggling with getting people back to work in the same way that really, and at least at academic sites, we have lost a lot of people because when you take care of patients, you gotta be there. You really can't be remote, at least not all the time. And so we lose people to lots of other jobs where they can be remote, and they're more satisfied that way. So we have less staff than we used to have, and we're dealing with new changes, and so the staff is less burdened because we're not collecting all these things. And then the piece of it on a trial is once you collect the data, there's somebody in the background looking at data saying, is that correct? So all the data points you have, the more data points you have, the more that have to be what we call audited, and so the staff has to respond to that. So on every aspect, the burden is reduced, from patients to staff to everybody. This trial opened in March, and I don't know the number today, but in 3 months period, we have about 40 patients, which is unheard of, and that because sites are opening over time, and there's still many sites that haven't opened, but even in the last month, we entered 20 patients. So this is a trial that can get patients on it. And again, with the buy-in with the FDA and this is a new way of thinking about it. We've had so many, our industry partners are saying, we have to collect this, we have to do this. And even the FDA is saying, no, you don't. We're gonna keep it simple. So it is a test. It is a test to see if this can work. But for the right drugs, we're not gonna do this for drugs where we don't know the side effects. We wanna keep our patients safe, but for the right drugs, for the right scenario, people are thinking about this. And then that's where Judy comes in, because we kept a pulse with Judy for this study from the very beginning. And I don't know, from your perspective, Judy, if you could describe your experience. And I will tell you, I was uncomfortable all along the way because we kept taking things out. And that's not how we run trials. Are very prescriptive in what we need to do. And so the more we took out, the more it makes us all like we're looking for our training wheels and we don't have them. So I'd love to hear Judy's perspective.
Well, I mean, all I can say is I'm so excited about it because, as we have acknowledged, patients are the highest priority. And if we can't get them on clinical trials that they can complete safely and help the site run those studies without too much burden, then we can't answer the questions that need to be answered. And like Dr. Reckamp said, to have 42 patients, and I just checked this today, enrolled in 3 months, that's unbelievable. That is just amazing. And I think that many of them are in the community hospital setting, which means more people who could not enroll on those studies can now do so because they're accessible, because the treatments are out there, they're standard, they're approved, they're available. So I can't tell you how excited I am about this trial. It's really awesome, and I'm just happy to be working with the whole team on it.
Judy, and I love the work that you do on behalf of all patients to help make clinical trials more accessible to everyone. And I hope that people in the room and those watching, with the examples that Dr. Reckamp just walked through and Judy and Andrew have spoken to, this is definitely not the era of your grandfather's clinical trials, right? Or your great-grandfather's clinical trials. I mean, your voices are being heard. People are listening. And the community as a whole is really trying their best to make these types of trials more accessible to you. So what I want to ask Dr. Reckamp next is, who and when should someone consider a clinical trial?
So, I mean, I think everyone and always is kind of the, I mean, from a investigator perspective and a person who has been in the lung cancer research arena for 20 years, I want to study everything about everybody if I can. And so the simple things like blood collections or tissue or things like that, if that works for you, those things are easy to do. For treatment clinical trials, you should always consider it, but it's not always the right time. We go through phases of studies being opened. You know, the ALK inhibitors, the timing was kind of perfect for the X396, it sounds like, but sometimes it's not the right time, and had alectinib been available, that might have been the right next drug for you, but obviously it wasn't. But that, if that was on the market, that might have been the simplest thing to do. So it's really is a conversation with your physician, but also, if you're in more of a community setting where they're not talking about trials, asking that question and potentially getting a referral to a bigger institution. And now, at least mostly in state, we can do virtual visits and things like that. So I even in LA, I do virtual visits sometimes with people from Northern California or things like that, just to talk about it. Because it's a relatively small world, even internationally. And so as these new drugs are coming down, it may not be the right time now, but there may be some opening in the future. And so thinking about it kind of all the time, but I do think you need a guide, unless you have, when you have a specific alteration, then the online forums are very good. If you don't have a alteration and you have more of a general lung cancer, sometimes you need a guide, because if you just start, and so that's where I think Andrew and his group are very, very helpful, because if you look up clinicaltrials.gov on your own, you could be there for days, and it's like a labyrinth, and you may not, and every trial is so exquisitely specific. If you've had this many therapies, it may not be for you, and so you really have to have guides to help you through it. So the GO2 Foundation is really helpful, and having advocacy and having those types of groups can be very helpful. But ultimately, connecting with a physician who can have that conversation with you too can be helpful too. And I think there are a lot more ways for people to get that, even if they're not if it's not accessible, to drive there or to get there in person.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Having those shared decision conversations with your healthcare providers is such an important thing, but it's also important that you're educated on your disease when you're having those conversations, and I think that's where the Lung Match team, and I want Andrew to speak to it. We have a couple of questions I want to grab first, Andrew, but I want you to kind of walk through, what a phone call will look like when a lung patient comes in. Rick, hold 1 second. I think there was a question online. Yeah.
So it's really active online. Betty, Gail, and Denise, thank you so much for sharing your story. One question, and of course my biggest nightmare, it's I have to pronounce the drug, I cannot figure it out. Amivantamab?
Amivantamab.
Yes, thank you. And I heard you say it earlier. They want to know if that is still in trial.
So that's actually an approved drug, but it's approved for a very specific type of lung cancer called exon 20 EGFR, and we are using it in other types of lung cancer. And so for some people it is approved, for some.
Next question is there a movement in requiring the testing company giving a patient full information about their biomarker testing?
I don't know how to answer that, but I mean, most of the time, if any test that you get, you have access to it, so you should get full information. And most of the testing companies have a portal that patients can go into and get that information. Sometimes they're getting it before I do. Okay. So I think the whole ACA, where patient information, most scans go out to patients before I see them, and so the patient information and just know, any patient should know that if it's your information, you should have access to it. And sometimes it's harder to get to than others, but there should be no question that you should be able to have access to it.
Yeah, and I think Andrew can speak to that too.
Well, and she wanted to clarify her question. Sorry to interrupt. She said to clarify her question, I must have said it wrong. Who owns results of the biomarker testing patients have in the course of entering clinical trials? So if you're getting biomarker testing within the clinical trial, who owns that?
Well, that's a complicated question. So, I mean, if you're getting it a standard test through a standard platform that's public, or that's reportable, like in the chart, then it's public, or public at least to the patient, and usable by anybody who can go into the chart if the patient allows it. But if it is a study and a specific test that is research related, then the company or whoever is the sponsor of that study is going to own that, and you don't always get those results, unfortunately. Yeah, we try to get that for patients, but it's not always in real time. Sometimes they're doing it in batches, so that's still a difficult piece.
Rick.
Another note, and if you're thinking about a trial, the first rule of thumb is if what you're on is working, like if you're on an approved drug and it's working fine, why would you switch? If it ain't broke, don't change it. So I would say that would be your first thing. The second thing is if you're having issues with side effects or other things that you might want to change, then always know what's available. Knowledge is king. Know what's going on with your disease. Stay in touch with your doctors and just be aware of what your body is doing. Every single person reacts differently to every single drug. Just because something is good for one, it doesn't mean it's good for another. Just because something is bad for one, it doesn't mean it's bad for you. So always keep that in mind. Keep an open mind as to finding out what you can do, have all your options, understand your options, and you can make an informed decision.
Thanks, Rick. I am being mindful of time, but Andrew, I really want to get back to you really quickly about Lung Match, and the question came up, well, the first time before we actually got the question right, but around the biomarker testing results coming to the patients, because I know you and others from science and research and support services have been in conversations with diagnostic companies about how those results are reported back out and how confusing they might be to patients as well. So what role does Lung Match play there? Uh-oh. Why does that keep
We're not
happening?
hearing you.
What access
You're
to
good.
information are you going to get, and if there's a test being done as part of the clinical trial, what information are you going to receive, and understand the difference between what Dr. Rekamp was saying earlier, which is, are there experimental tests going on? Are there, regular standard tests that you will receive? And it's just part of the decision-making process about a clinical trial. But a lot of this, a lot of this is kind of confusing and trying to sort through, what the different aspects of clinical trials are. So that's where, finding a partner is always a good thing. A lot of the resources out there, you definitely start with your doctor and asking about clinical trials there. And there's a lot of great resources. There's online patient groups that were mentioned earlier that have really started to help put together information about clinical trials and share their experiences on clinical trials. But adding into that, a lot of advocacy organizations, including GoTo, have tried to help be that partner, to look more at clinical trials. And that's where LungMatch comes into play. And so basically, LungMatch is an opportunity to call in and connect to someone like myself or other people on GoTo staff who have a background in research, helping you translate what clinical research options are good for you. So we help do clinical trial searches, as mentioned before. When you look at clinicaltrials.gov, which is kind of the main Google or search engine for clinical trials, it can often return back a lot of results. It's hard to narrow it down. The information was written really for the researchers, not really at patient level language. And so, taking from the 100 results you might get there and get down to the 2 or 3 that might be really worth asking about your doctor, that's what we help with. What are some good questions you can ask at your next appointment, about real relevant clinical trial results and making the best use of your time. We just try to cut down the time and sort through all the stuff that's out there so that, you are prepared to go that conversation more easily with your provider. And, that's a great, LungMatch is, a great resource to have. And, just having it in the toolbox is like a lot of those other things that were mentioned before can potentially be a real help. Because it does take a lot of effort to understand, what make that decision.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. So as we're wrapping up, I think what I'd like to do is ask the panelists for any final thoughts or take-home points you'd like to reiterate. Judy, do you want to start? Oh.
Sure. I think one of the things I've learned is really important to collaborate with organizations like GoTo, Longevity, and some of the smaller roots organizations like EGFR Resistors, AOK, KRAS. I've met many people through Andrew and others that have built my knowledge and helped me do a better job as a lung cancer patient advocate. So I think my takeaway is collaborate, work with others, use resources like LungMatch, and just be fully informed, as your speaker that was in the living room said about the trial that he was in, which was really great to hear. So I'm glad you got to share that information. Thank you for letting me be on this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity.
We appreciate you. Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, everything that everybody shared here today has, just been spot on. I think, if I had to do a takeaway message, it's that whenever you really face a treatment decision or a decision about your care, there's an opportunity to have a discussion about clinical trials and find out what's there at that point in time. But that can be a big undertaking. All the stuff we've heard today about the different types of clinical trials, different way things are getting done, that can be a lot to sort through. Just know that there are resources out there. There's things like, organizations that were mentioned, LungMatch, other organizations, the patient groups, connecting with each other. This is it kind of, as Judy mentioned, there's kind of a whole lung cancer community that's trying to work on, making clinical trials better for patients and helping people sort their information out there. And so I would say, don't hesitate to have that conversation with your provider, with others, about how clinical trials might fit in and, whether or not it's a good decision for you, because there's a lot to sort out there. And it's a process, but there's people who are willing to kind of, help.
Thanks, Andrew. Dr. Redcamp.
So I would say that, I've been a part of this transformation of lung cancer. When I was in training, we thought of lung cancer as non-small cell and small cell. And since that time, because I've been in lung cancer research, I have been a part of this transformation of lung cancer into multiple diseases, into people with early stage and late stage living longer, being treated as individual people. And I see this big word hope, like the hope of what's in lung cancer is drastically different today than it was 20 years ago, and that's because of clinical research. And so I don't know what comes 20 years from now, but the clinical research will be an essential part, and every years that we go by makes cancer, lung cancer, a livable disease. And sometimes when people now ask me about their prognosis, even people with advanced disease when they get diagnosed, most of the time my answer is I don't really know. You know, we have things. I have one example is a patient who actually never went on a trial, but benefited from every point in the way, was diagnosed back in 2009 before we knew a lot about, we knew about EGFR, maybe we knew about ALK. I think she was tested for ALK on a trial, trying to get in a trial, all negative. We gave this person an EGFR inhibitor at one point because EGFR inhibitors were approved for everybody. They weren't just approved for people with EGFR mutation. It did not work, but this person had benefit to initial therapies, and then we found a BRAF mutation and benefited from BRAF therapy that was being developed in melanoma, and then got onto immunotherapy, which was spectacular and had 100% PD-L1 and lived with lung cancer because of what we found in trials, and not a person who had a driver from the beginning of that diagnosis. So there is a lot of new research going on. We're learning from lung cancer, we're learning from other diseases, we're getting better at treating it, and the better you do with any therapy, the more likely you are to get to that next breakthrough. And so we appreciate your engagement. You're all here and engaged, and we appreciate that. But I've seen the benefits, and it is fully worthwhile.
That's great. Thank you. Go ahead, Ray.
So with this whole thing, one of my sayings from the very beginning, you know this too, Danielle. Danielle, from the very beginning, my saying has always been, all you have to do is live long enough to get the next best thing. And all you got to do is live long enough to get the next best thing. I've been saying this for 8.5 years, and so far it's working great. So all you do, live long enough to get the next best thing. You guys keep doing your job. It's great. Love it.
And the choice is always yours. So one thing that I always say to patients when they're signing up for a trial, it is voluntary. So if it's not working for you, the choice is always yours. As much as the investigator or your physician may be invested in it and wants you to do it, the choice is yours. So don't lose sight of the power that you have in that relationship, because this is your life and your cancer, and each step of the way you're in charge.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all for your participation. And I think not only tonight, but thank you to those of you who have and or are considering participating in clinical trials. I know Dr. Rickham just said it, but I don't think you all are thanked enough, because it is true. The last 20 years have been an incredible time for discovery for this disease, and that wasn't the case for a half century before that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We don't just need funding, right? We need people. So if you guys have questions, if anyone has questions or wants to learn more about clinical trials or the process, please reach out to our Lung Match team. They'll be happy to talk you through things that we discussed tonight, and can help guide you towards questions to ask your healthcare providers about the possibility of you participating. I am going to say thank you to our panel. Thank you all for coming here today and having this very important conversation. We couldn't do this programming without you guys either. So thank you very much. Up next, our next living room is July 18th. And it's our very traditional annual Best of ASCO. So all things ASCO will be discussed at that meeting next month with Dr. Sarah Goldberg from Yale. And one of the sort of comments that was sort of trending throughout ASCO while I was there was, kind of speaking to how much things have changed over the last 20 years is, to Dr. Reckham's point, it was non-small cell and small cell, right? And that was really all anybody was really talking about. And now it's really a series of rare diseases. I mean, when you start breaking down all of the different biomarkers and these subgroups, and I think the work that those groups have done to kind of pull together and gather information is also incredible. So please join us next month for that. Again, huge thank you to our panelists, those of you watching live, those of you live in the room, Onyx and Ash, who will pull together a very beautiful edited version of this meeting, Penn Media, who's in the back and out here in the room with all of the cameras, the entire GoTo team for all your support that you give, not only at this programming, but to our patient community as well. Our supporters, I would be remiss in not thanking them, so it's a long list. Amgen, AstraZeneca, Boehringer, Ingelheim, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai, Foundation Medicine, Genentech, Janssen Oncology, Merck, Mirati Therapeutics, Novartis, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda. That's a long list because they recognize that this type of programming matters to keep you all abreast of what's going on too. So thank you all so much, and we will see you next month.
I just want to say Summer Rays is opening, or I'm an events person, so I got to put my plug in, and they gave me a mic, so here we go. We have Summer Rays opening tomorrow. So Summer Rays is taking a step around the world, or steps around the world, to show our partners and everything that we do in lung cancer, and that opens tomorrow. And then also we have Houston coming up. Help me, Katie. Thank you. And then we have San Francisco 5K for everyone in the room coming up September. Thank you, Katie. So, and we have more, but I just want to give a quick brief. Those are coming up quick. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody. If you didn't get food, please come get some food.
I'll be brave, but only